I don't know how else to say this except to say that I feel like I have been set up. And the reason I say that is because I am following all these incredible voices, these incredible singers, this incredible spoken word poetry, and I can only carry a tune in the shower, and my wife would probably argue with me about that one. So I am not going to sing to you. I am going to do something else, and I hope that it will capture your attention as much as all of the previous program. I want to thank the Reverend. I want to thank everyone here at the church for making this possible, and all of you for coming out. It is an honor to be here. It is also an honor always for me when I am asked to speak really anywhere and at any time, but particularly at this time of year during the celebration of Black History Month because, well, there are a number of reasons, but among them, and key among them, is the fact that I am not actually black, which may not surprise you, but then again, one really never knows. And so not being black, being a white man aspiring to be an ally in the struggle against racism and institutional white supremacy, when such a person is asked to come and speak, particularly at this time of the year, it must be, at least I hope, because someone somewhere has decided that I have something unique to offer to this particular type of an event. And so we'll see if that's true. And I want to also tell you that I realize going into any kind of talk about race at any time of year and in any venue, that I know that this is not the topic that people generally want to discuss. I know nobody really likes to talk about the issue of race and racism for different reasons. People of color don't want to talk about it, particularly with white folks around, because they understand that there is a better than decent likelihood that when they do so, there will be white folks in the room who will dismiss, who will minimize, who will accuse them of exaggerating the problem or playing a race card or whatever terminology it is that we like to use so as not to deal with the issue. And so people of color know that often it's best to just shut down as opposed to getting into that space where they may be minimized or even retaliated against. And by the same token, those of us who are white, we don't like to have the conversation with people of color around, also because of fear, but a different fear. And this is what the research says. This isn't just me telling you what I think. The research says that white folks don't like to engage the topic of race with people of color around because we are deathly afraid that we are going to say the wrong thing, that we are going to say something that will be perceived as racist. Oh my God, if I open my mouth, they might think that I'm racist. Okay, news flash for the white folk in the room. People of color already think there's a pretty decent chance that we are. So you don't need to worry about opening your mouth because the perception is already there. So can we just move through that, you see, because there's an interesting third body of research that tells us, ironically, that it is the very process of shutting down. It is the very moment when those of us who are white do not talk about race, even though it is the elephant in the room. It is that very moment when we refuse to engage the subject that folks of color then start to think maybe the reason we aren't talking about it is because we have something to hide. That's the irony, you see. So the silence only confirms the preconceived notion we would be better off to just have the conversation, make the mistake, and then fix the mistake, move on, and try to do better next time. But instead, we shut down for very different reasons, and we do it even though right now we're at a point in our history, and I mean this now as a country, where we, in all likelihood, need to be having this discussion more than ever for a lot of reasons, and people don't understand that all the time. They think, now how could it be more necessary now to talk about racism than it was, say, 40 and 50 years ago? Well, there are a lot of reasons that I could give you, but perhaps the most important of them is this, and this is beyond the moral and practical and the ethical concerns that I'll try to address this evening. It is a practical matter, you see, because within 25 to 30 years, it is a simple fact, it is not arguable, it is not contestable, it is not up for discussion or debate. Within 25 to 30 years, half of this country will be people of color and half will be white. That is a fact, and it doesn't matter whether folks like it or not. I know there are some folks that don't like it. I know there are some white people in Arizona who are very particularly upset about it. But what I also know about white folks in Arizona, because I was there just a few months ago, is that the average age of white folks in Arizona is about 137. So what this means is that with a little patience and some decent grassroots organizing, we will in all likelihood outlast them. They will lose. And please, I am in church. Do not misunderstand. I am not advocating the death of old white people in the state of Arizona, least of all in a church. I am not advocating their demise. I am simply saying everyone dies. And some people die sooner than others. And age is highly correlated, as we say, with that particular condition of being. So the reality is that whether there are some folk in the white community who wish to avoid the coming of that new day, the rest of us, if we are prepared to embrace it and make something of it, can indeed outlast them. But now that is a very open question. The mere fact that they will pass on into that good night, so to speak, does not guarantee the coming of real multiracial democracy, does not guarantee the coming of justice. Only we, by our actions, can do that. And in order to do that, we will have to have this conversation. And yet at this very moment, we're being told that we needn't have it. We're being told for a number of reasons that we needn't have it. We're being told, for instance, that if we talk about race and racism, especially the legacy of white supremacy institutionally throughout the generations, throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, that is tantamount to getting stuck in the past. That's what nice, very concerned and caring white folks will tell people of color when they talk about the issue of racism. Oh, now, you can't get stuck in the past. You talk about all that stuff that happened a really long time ago, you're going to get stuck in the past. You have to come into the present and look toward the future. This is precious. Coming from conservative white folk who actually love the past so much that they tell us they want to go back to it. When you have taken as your political touchstone in the current moment something called the Tea Party, which is a pretty old reference, you are in no position to lecture anyone about the past, you see. When you come to political rallies wearing powdered wigs, carrying muskets, and calling yourself the Tea Party wearing tri-cornered hats, you are in no position to lecture anyone about sticking to the present and not getting stuck in the past, you see. So I thank the Tea Party for getting rid of that argument forever. But really, they love the past. Folks love the past as long as it makes us feel good. Right? That's what July 4th is. That breaking away from the British thing, that didn't happen last Wednesday. That was a very long time ago. And yet we talk about it every 4th of July. We set off fireworks, we eat hot dogs and apple pie and do all of that patriotic stuff because we love the past when it makes us feel good. We just don't want to deal with the ugly. And you don't get to deal with one and not the other because it's all part of your history. So we have to talk about it. But of course, people tell you no, we don't. In fact, it's very interesting. You know, I get angry emails. That will surprise you, I'm sure. That will come as a huge, huge shock to you. And sometimes they're angry, and sometimes they're just sarcastic. And among the sarcastic ones, you know, people will write to me, and they'll come up to me after speeches, and they'll say things, and they don't know they sound like a jerk, but maybe they don't even mean to, but they do. And this is what they say. They say, Tim, you know, this whole race hustle that you've got, because, you know, that's it. It's a hustle. It's a hustle. This race hustle that you have going on, it's so 2007. That's what they say. Right? They say, because this thing happened, maybe you didn't hear about it, Tim. Maybe you missed it, but this thing happened in 2008, you know, maybe you didn't know that a black guy won the presidency, so now you need to find a new hustle because it's obvious that you can't have a problem with racism, and you certainly can't have a problem with white privilege and have a black man in the White House. How could you, they say, have racism and white privilege and still have a man of color as president of the United States? I don't know. Let's think about it for a second. If I were to suggest to you that women and girls have fully equal opportunity in Pakistan, and that sexism and patriarchy have been forever smashed in Pakistan, and this I know because Benazir Bhutto, a woman, was elected not once but twice in that country. She has since been assassinated, so that lets us know just how some folks felt about her. But if I were to tell you, if I were to tell the women in this room, if I were to tell my own daughters, ages 8 and 10, that you know what you really ought to do is pack your bags and move to Karachi, because there You will have fully equal opportunity. Or perhaps India or Israel or Great Britain or the Philippines, all of them have had female heads of state, because if the standard for determining whether a society is fair and equitable and just is that a member of a marginalized group cannot possibly become the head of state, then in all of those places we would have to conclude that sexism had been eradicated. And even my 8-year-old daughter would tell me, no, Daddy. But that's the argument, just because a president of color is in the White House suggests to us that we need not have this conversation. What's interesting, though, is it's not just folks on the right who don't want to have this conversation. If it were, this would be a whole lot easier, because we could isolate them and the rest of us could have the conversation, right? But the fact is, there are a lot of folks who consider themselves quite progressive, who consider themselves quite liberal, whatever that's supposed to mean, who consider themselves on the left of the political spectrum, and they don't want to talk about it either. Now, for different reasons, perhaps, but regardless of the motivation for one's silence, the outcome of that silence is the same, you see. The President of the United States does not want to have this conversation. I know his reasons for not wanting it are different than many others. But again, regardless of his motivations, political though they may be, for not engaging this topic at a high level, understand the consequence, the outcome, the effect of his and our silence is the same regardless of the motivation. And we know that he doesn't want to talk about it. We know this because the very first time that most of us became aware or familiar with Barack Obama was in 2004, when he was at the Democratic National Convention in Boston. He was a state senator in Illinois at the time, running for U.S. Senate, a position that he would win, of course, that November. So he wasn't known to a lot of people, but he got up and he gave that talk. And it put him on the national stage, and you'll recall it was, like so many of his speeches, an incredible piece of oratory, but there was one line in particular that stood out in terms of the reaction that it got both from the press and from the people in the convention hall. It was that line where he said, and he said it with all sincerity to a crowd that wanted desperately to hear it. He said, "We are not a white America and a black America and a Latino America and an Asian America. We are the United States of America." And everybody just went all noodly. They just, oh my God. Oh my God. So beautiful. Right? The applause went on forever. Like 30 minutes in, it was late. I had 2 small children. I was old. I was tired. I'm like, I got to go to bed. I woke up the next morning, turned on the Today Show, and they are still clapping for that one line. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. It was a huge applause break. Right? And I remember sitting there thinking in that moment, what does it say about our country? What does it say about our culture that a man as intelligent as that, because, even people that don't like him politically will usually give him credit for at least being bright. Now, I know Donald Trump doesn't think so. Donald Trump, is not sure that Barack Obama actually earned his way into the Ivy League schools, from which he graduated magna cum laude, which they don't just give out for fun. You have to earn that. But Donald Trump thinks that Barack Obama didn't deserve to be in those schools. Donald Trump, a man who got $10 million from his daddy to start his first business, has the temerity to question whether somebody else earned what they have. Donald Trump, who in 2008 endorsed McCain and Palin, one of whom graduated 5th from the bottom of the Naval Academy and only got in because his daddy was an admiral, and the other of whom went to 6 colleges in 5 years, damn near didn't graduate from any of them. He has the temerity to question the academic credentials of that man, but that is a different speech for a different evening. Back to the point. Most people, Donald Trump accepted, will acknowledge that the man is at least intelligent, regardless of what you may think of him politically. And yet in that moment, as I was watching him, hearing that line, going to bed, thinking about that line, waking up and hearing it over and over on the morning news and the evening news, over and over again, I kept thinking, what does it say that a man that intelligent looked at all of us and felt that he had no option but to lie to us? Because he had to know it was a lie. That very summer, A study had just been released from MIT and from the University of Chicago, which found what? That job applicants with quote-unquote white-sounding names were 50% more likely to be called back for an interview than applicants with black-sounding names, even when all the qualifications were the same years of experience, same educational background. Simply being thought of as white was enough to get you in the door at a 50% higher rate. Barack Obama had to know about that at the moment that he said we were a united country, which is to say that he felt for whatever reason, his own political career or because he understands the culture in which we live, that he had to tell us lies. He had to know at that very moment that the Justice Department was collecting data which they would release 4 months later, a follow-up study to one done 3 years prior, which found what? That black and Latino men 2 to 3 times more likely to have their cars stopped and to be searched for drugs as white men, even though white men on the occasions when we were searched were 4 times more likely to have the stuff on us. Now let me say that again, because that was not in the news. That is not data that you have likely heard before. You haven't heard it from a political candidate in either party. You haven't heard it from the mainstream press. Black and brown men, 2 to 3 times more likely to be stopped and searched. White men, 4 times more likely to be guilty on the occasions when we were searched. Now, I did not need a government study to tell me where the drugs were. I could have told you from personal experience. And since this is a church and the statute of limitations has expired, I will just be honest. I worked as a community organizer in public housing in the city of New Orleans for 15 months in the mid-90s, at a time when it was, according to the people who rank these things, and I don't know who does that, but whoever it is, that time in New Orleans, that public housing system was considered the worst in America, the most dangerous, the most violent, the most crime-ridden, the most drug-infested. And yet, in the 15 months that I worked in those communities, one after the other, virtually every public housing community in the city of New Orleans, in that entire 15-month period, I saw fewer drugs than I saw on a typical weekend on the 8th floor of Monroe Hall at Tulane University from the fall of 1986 until the spring of 1987, my freshman year, my hall, my dorm. In fact, I saw fewer drugs in 15 months in public housing than I saw on a typical Saturday night in room 804, which I think was my room. I said I think because, you know, that's what drugs will do. Not to make light of it and not to romanticize drug use, please. I'm just reminiscing. Just say no, just say no, just say no. I'm simply saying that what Barack Obama, then state senator, soon to be U.S. senator, now president, told us, that we were not a black, white, Latino, or Asian America, that we were united, was not true. And there isn't any evidence to suggest that it was true. And notice, he didn't say it in the aspirational tense. Like if he had said, if we do the following things, we will be, that would have been fine. Like nobody would question that. That's what politicians are supposed to do. They aspire to things, but he said it in the present and descriptive sense. He lied to us. Why? Because he figured, and he's probably right in this, that we can't handle the truth, and not just we in the royal entire national sense, but that we as white folks in particular can't handle the truth because black and brown people already know it. So what does it say? What does it say that even now, as president, now think about this, he is the president of the United States of America. He is arguably the most powerful man in the country, if not the world, and he still cannot come in front of an audience and say anything that I have said tonight except for, hello, thank you for inviting me. Because everything after that would end his political career, or at least harm it. What does that say? That the president has to continue to prevaricate, that the president has to continue to cover up, and I can stand up here and say anything that I choose, and people of color in this room who aren't the president know that the same is true in your workplace, that the same is true in the schools that you attend, or the schools that your children attend. I know what white privilege is, and I know I embody it every time that I open my mouth. If we don't learn anything else doing this work, it is that until people of color can, be it the president or anyone in this room of color, stand in front of an audience, and not just in a black church, but in a white church, and not just in a black neighborhood, but in a white neighborhood, not just in a black community, but in an almost all white community, and tell the truth, then we're in trouble. And when people try to blame the conversation for the problem, because that's what they do, They make no sense. It's like blaming the speedometer for the speeding ticket that you just got. The speedometer didn't cause you to go 165. It just told you what happened. The conversation is not to blame, and there's not another problem on the planet that we would say the solution to that problem was talking about it less, right? You wouldn't say that about world hunger. Right? There are billions of people on this planet starving to death. Now, would anybody in their right mind say, shh, don't talk about that? If you talk about starvation, people are going to starve, fool. Keep your mouth shut. If you just don't talk about that, food will miraculously appear on the plates of hungry children. No, it won't. Only when you talk about and then take action on a problem will that happen. But instead, we are being encouraged to be not only colorblind, that is to say, not to even notice or think about color, but even worse, color mute, not to speak of it, right? Not to speak of it. And there's danger in that. First of all, you cannot solve a race-specific, color-specific injury. You cannot solve race and color-specific inequality if we're not allowed to speak about the thing that brought about the injustice and the inequality. As Julian Bond has said many times, to be blind to color is to be blind to the consequence of color. And if color continues to have consequence, we must address those, and you can't do it by being colorblind or color mute. But worse than that, to not speak of this issue and the inequalities that still plague us, be it in the job market, the housing market, the schools, the justice system, or anywhere else, is to ensure that the problem will actually get worse. Let me explain what I mean by that. See, I don't think of this anymore only as an activist or as an advocate or as a scholar or whatever it is that I am in my professional capacity. I think of it as a father. Because as a father, as a parent, anyone who's a parent, you know that you have those things in your head. You're trying to figure out when your children are learning certain things. Like, when do they first figure something out? And I don't just mean about racism. I mean about rain, where flowers come from. Why does the light come on when you flick the switch on the wall? All those kind of questions that kids ask you. And I know the answers to all those, by the way. You just Google it. That's my answer. You just look it up. I don't really know, but I know where we can find out. But see, when it's natural phenomena, it's easy, like electricity or lightning or photosynthesis. I mean, you can look that up. But when it comes to something like race, how do children learn that, right? What's the process? Because it's a lot more complicated than just learning 2 + 2 = 4. You can just get taught that, you can memorize it, we're done, right? But how do children learn about race? Well, I started thinking about this in earnest once I became a father, because I was trying to inoculate my white children as best I could from the poison that I knew was out there, just as parents of color, for different reasons, but in similar fashion, try to inoculate their children against the poisons that are out there, whether it's racism, sexism, or any other form of oppression. And so I remember sitting there thinking about it, and it came to me that the biggest danger that our children face is the secular gospel of our country itself. Because the one thing that bonds every single one of us in this room together, regardless of race, ethnicity, cultural background, religion, age, geographic region of origin, first language of origin, anything, the one thing we all have in common, if we've been in this country for even a minute, is that we were all taught one thing in common. And what was it? It was the American creed, right? This idea that if you just work hard, it'll be okay, everything will work out. You can be anything you want if you just work hard enough. If you make it, it's because it was your own effort. If you didn't make it, there's something wrong with you. You should try harder. You can be anything you want. That is the secular gospel of our country. Don't get me wrong. I understand why we tell our children that. Don't get me wrong. I tell my daughters that. I tell them, you can be anything you want if you just try hard enough. But you see, the difference between the way I say it and the way the culture says it is at the end of that sentence, I insist on putting the asterisks, right? And what do I mean by the asterisk at the end of that sentence? I mean the little symbol that takes you to the bottom of the page and tells you, or at least in my case, tells my daughters, that in order for that thing Daddy just told you to be true and not to be a horrible, horrible lie, you will not only have to work hard as individuals, you will have to work hard to change the minds and the systems that operate to deny full and equal opportunity to you as women, because there will be boys and there will be men in this culture who, because you are female, will determine that you are lesser. So you must not only work hard as an individual, you must work hard collectively to dismantle systems of oppression. But see, this society does not believe in the asterisks. This society just gives us the myth unhindered, the myth unexpurgated, the myth not dissected, not examined, not interrogated, that people can just be whatever they want to be. And the problem with that, absent the rejoinder about collective liberation. Absent the asterisk that reminds us of systemic injustice is that it sets folks up, because if little children believe that it's all on them and their own individual initiative, and then they look around and they see inequality, they can see it with their own eyes by the time they are 3 or 4 or 5. They don't have to be sociologists or anthropologists to be able to see it. They just have to be awake. And then they look around and they can see who lives in what part of town and who lives in the other, and what the infrastructure in one neighborhood versus the other looks like. They can see who goes to those schools mostly and who goes to those schools mostly, and the quality of the resources in the one as opposed to the other. They can see with their own eyes who's getting marched off to jail in the first 8 minutes of the local news every single night, not because they're the only ones doing crime, but they're the only ones the media chooses to focus on doing perp walks in black and brown neighborhoods, and not one perp walk on Wall Street, not one. Even though the white folks on Wall Street that just made off with approximately $12 trillion of other people's money did more damage in 18 months than all the black and brown street thugs could if you put them together and gave them 5,000 years, they still couldn't get $12 trillion. And I know people get nervous when I mention that the guys on Wall Street were white. They say things like, well, now, is that really relevant? Do you really have to mention? That's sort of racist. It may not be relevant, but here's what I know. If those folks had been black, we would have been talking about race. If they had been black and lost $12 trillion of white people's money, we would be talking about race. In fact, the conversation would sound like this. Where did they get these jobs anyway? How did they get them? Oh, I think I know. They got those jobs because of affirmative action. As opposed to the merit system that used to get us those jobs, better known as Daddy's personal contact list. But it would literally take 5,000 years for black and brown criminals to steal as much as these white folks, who we don't call criminal, but that's a technicality, managed to lose in 18 months. And they would have to rob you. Now I'm talking about the black and brown street thug, like all around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And you'd be 5 millennia into this thing, and you'd ask them, hey, you got 12 trillion? And they'd be like, no, not even close. Come back in like 2,000 years. Right? Every year, the FBI estimates $6 billion is stolen in street crime, and most of it not by black people. But even if every penny was stolen by black folks, $6 billion is 1/20th of 1% of the amount that was lost because of the actions of these folks on Wall Street. Interesting that we are still more afraid of a black or brown male crossing the street in our direction wearing a hoodie than we are of rich white men driving around in their Lexuses, or maybe the word is Lexi. I don't know the proper plural form, but... So that's where we are. That's the legacy that we have inherited, is we're more afraid of the usual suspects, no matter the fact that the unusual suspects are the ones who are destroying the country, not the ones we've been taught to fear. So we have to talk to young people, because if they see that inequality and all they've been given is this individualistic lens with which to understand it, you know what they conclude. They conclude that the folks on top must be there because they're actually better. They must have worked harder. Maybe they're culturally or biologically superior, and the people on the bottom must be there because they don't want it as bad. They don't have the right values. They don't have the right genetic code. You see, in other words, if we don't explain to our young people, white and of color, the systemic realities that perpetuate the inequalities that they can see before they are out of elementary school, we will reinforce racism in their minds. Whether it is internalized supremacy on the part of white folks or internalized oppression on the part of black and brown folk, because they can see the same injustice. And unless we're honest about the reasons for those inequalities, we will default, so to speak, to the culture's dominant explanation, which essentially tells us that there's nothing we can do or should do. But I want you to understand why this is so incredibly important, not just for people of color. For folks of color, it ought to be obvious why injustice is a problem and something to be fought against. But I want, for the white folks here and for those who know some white people, because we're everywhere, like it's hard to work around us. So even the folk of color in this room, you probably bump into us from time to time. I mean, you know, we're sort of like Visa. We're everywhere you want to be. You know, it's just sort of like, it's hard to avoid. It's like that little boy in The Sixth Sense that sees dead people. If you're black or brown, you see white people. We're everywhere. But so everybody knows some white folks. So for those individuals who are white, and it's something that I have to talk about, again, with my children and my white brothers and sisters, it's understanding that the current crisis that we're in as a country, and by this I mean now the economic crisis that is battering so many millions of people of all races and ethnicities. This is a crisis that has its roots in the system of racial injustice. We don't talk about that much. You won't hear that analysis coming from any presidential candidate, congressional candidate, Senate candidate. You won't hear it from the media, but it's very hard to argue with. A couple of reasons. Number one, think about the unemployment crisis, right? We have white folks right now who for the first time since the Great Depression, for the first time in 3 generations, are facing in many communities double-digit unemployment. They've never seen that before. Now that's not new for everybody, is it? Double-digit unemployment is not new for black folk, it's not new for Latino folk, it's not new for indigenous Native North American folk, it's not new for Southeast Asian folk. All of those groups have had consistently double-digit unemployment in good times and bad ever since the data started being kept. But for those of us who are white, this is like horrifyingly unique. And I'm not trying to downplay it, it's serious. Millions of folks out of work, white now, for 26 weeks, 52 weeks, some of them 99 weeks. But here's the thing. When that was only or almost only happening to black and brown folk, we didn't call it a crisis. We didn't have a stimulus bill. We didn't have congressional hearings. And so we didn't do anything about it. Maybe if we had cared about it when it was only those folks experiencing it, we would have intervened and done something. When black teenage unemployment hit 43% for the first time, which happened 8 or 9 years ago, we could have done something, but we didn't. And now white teens, in many instances, can't find jobs, and we're losing our mind, you see. Maybe if we hadn't been indifferent to the suffering when it was localized, we would have done something, but we did not. And even now, we will not. We got folks running around want to be president of the United States blaming black teenagers for their unemployment, telling them that they ought to be working as janitors in their own schools and rationalizing that by saying that black teens don't have any habits of work because they, quote unquote, don't know anyone who works, which is a statement that you could only make if you had never set foot in a black urban community, because in every poor community in this country, the majority of adults work and work hard every day, both in and out of the home. But you can lie about young black children. You can say that the reason they're out of work is that they don't have any work ethic, totally ignoring what any labor economist knows and what every citizen should, which is that you don't even get counted in the unemployment data unless you are looking actively for a job. So when people stand up and say the reason you don't have one is that you don't want one, they are lying to our faces and expecting us to ignore it and elect them anyway. That is where we are as a culture. And so then the unemployed white folks are finding out what happens when you cut that safety net, which they started doing in earnest 40 years ago, and they really turned it on 15 years ago because they didn't want to spend all that money on poor folk because poor folk weren't deserving. And now they're finding themselves in need of health care, and they're finding themselves in need of child care, and they're finding themselves in need of job training, and it's not there for them. That is the irony of racism. It may start here and its effects may be localized, but if you ignore it long enough, it will metastasize and spread like cancer, and that's what has happened. One more point. The housing crisis. Millions of people, including white folks, upside down in their mortgage, owe more than what the house is worth, have already been foreclosed on. Now, once again, this is not new news for everyone. This problem of subprime lending, of predatory lending with banks, and really not even banks so much as independent mortgage brokers that are virtually unregulated in this society. At least banks have some rules we ask them to play by, but independent mortgage brokers, there's almost no rules governing their conduct at all, and they rather like it that way. And so in the middle of the 1990s, these folks were coming into black and brown space and offering these loans at jacked up interest, keeping in mind that for 40 to 50 years before that, those same institutions had deliberately starved those communities of resources by redlining them out of their mortgage and business startup loan categories. And so in effect, you starve a community, and then knowing that they're starving, you come in and you offer them food and you offer them sustenance, but at a higher price than you're offering to other folks with the same credit score, with the same debt to income ratio, with the same occupational status, with the same income, because you know they're desperate and they want a piece of that American dream that you sold to them every day. But you tell them, don't worry, we'll refinance the loan if it gets out of hand. And so people fall for it. That started happening in black and brown communities in the mid-1990s. And nobody talked about it. The media didn't cover it. No presidential candidate in either party covered it. The only folks who tried to get this covered were the Congressional Black Caucus, specifically Maxine Waters, and nobody paid attention to her. They ignored it because they would say, well, you know, if these folks are too stupid to read the fine print on their loans, they don't deserve a house. Putting aside the evil of that indifference, on a purely ethical level, you see it doesn't work 20 years later, does it? Because 15 to 20 years out, that indifference, which maybe wasn't such a big deal when it was just one family in the neighborhood who'd been foreclosed on, but now when a third of the houses are on blocks, so to speak, when a third of the houses are upside down and in foreclosure, see, that indifference has just lowered the property value of everyone in the neighborhood, including the folks that paid their bills on time. And so all of those people who said it didn't affect them, maybe it didn't in 1996 and in 1997, but now this is 2012 and y'all are going down too. You see, that's the deal. And now two of the hardest hit communities in this country for foreclosure are Nassau County and Suffolk County. That's Long Island, that is white and mostly middle class. Mostly white and mostly middle class space, right? But because of the indifference, right? Because those lenders, when they realized that they weren't going to be stopped jacking certain people around, they decided, well, man, we'll leave the hood. We'll go out to the suburbs. That's fine. We know there's some people out there who think they can flip houses because they watched a show on Bravo. Y'all been watching HGTV. You think you can just flip houses. So we'll rip y'all off too. And then they said, well, we'll even go to the exurbs. You know what the exurbs are, right? That's that new geographic space that some white folks created when we discovered that the suburbs were too brown and that black folk actually, much to our chagrin, like Olive Garden as well. So we had to move even further out. And Countrywide didn't care. Countrywide said, fine, we'll go take advantage of people there too, because there's lots of money to be made from middle class folks who want to live like rich folks. And that's what most of those bad loans were. It wasn't poor people. It wasn't working class folks, and it wasn't folks of color. It's a thing called liar's loans. You know what a liar loan is, right? It's where you go in and they ask you, like, how much do you make? And you just pick a number, any number. And they don't even ask for proof, right? These are Alt-A liar loans, stated income loans. We know poor people didn't try to get away with this. Poor folks are not going to go into a lender and they're going to say, how much do you make? And the poor person says, oh, $500,000. Isn't it obvious? Poor people, white, black, and otherwise, know they can't get away with that. In fact, black folks who make $500,000 know they still cannot get away with that without paperwork. Like if you are black and make $500,000, you would bring every pay stub that you ever had into that lender, and they would still hold it up to the light to see if there was a watermark. But here's the point. Here's the point. None of that would have happened to all those white folks who are hurting right now. None of what this country is experiencing would have happened if we had taken seriously this problem when it was mostly localized in black and brown space. The point of this is to say that if we want to have any kind of hope for a progressive and equitable and just future for any of our children, whether they are white or whether they of color or are of color, we are going to have to prioritize the ending of racial inequity, because the reality of racial inequity is at the heart, the core of every single thing that is bringing the country down. And if we do not figure it out within that 20 to 30 year time frame when this demographic transition will be fully upon us, we will get to that day in 2030 when half of the country are folks of color. And if that half is still 3 times as likely as the white half to be poor, twice as likely to be unemployed, 9 years less life expectancy, double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight children 1/20th the net worth on average as those in the white half, we will not survive as a society. That is not a recipe for a functional economy, a functional political system, a functional culture. And if we leave that to our children and grandchildren, they will curse us, as well they should, unless we stand up now and insist from everyone who ever wants a vote, anyone who ever wants a dollar of our money, anyone who wants to educate our children and thinks they are entitled to do so, anyone who wants to provide us with health care, anyone that wants to offer jobs in a community, that unless they prioritize these issues of racial justice, they will get no support from any of us. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it.
I tell you, that's a bad white boy right there.